Ta-da! Here's a pelvis. This is a woman's pelvis. And in lab, you'll be able to compare a female pelvis to a male pelvis. But let's just introduce you to this the way I've been doing some other bones, which is just to name the bone and then to go over some of the features and landmarks of different bones, and then I'll later talk about functions. Okay, so when you take a look at a pelvis, there are 3 bones over here that make up one side, and then the same 3 bones over here. So let's just take a look at one of the sides, and I'll introduce you to the 3 bones. This upper bone here is called the ilium. So like when you put your hands on your hips, you're putting your hands on the ilium. And the ilium includes all of this portion, and then it comes here to this socket. And then taking a look here, anterior portion of the pelvis, there's this bone that's the pubis. Kind of comes in here a little bit, but then here comes pubis. And then this bone, that's kind of all of this more posterior, well, I should say inferior portion here, well, it is posterior too, is the ischium. So ilium, pubis, and ischium. All right, now that we know the names of the bones, let's take a look at some of the bone landmarks. And we'll start with the first bone I told you about, so the ilium. The ilium has this top portion called the iliac crest. And it's especially large in humans and thick. Well, you know, I'll talk about the muscle that attaches there later on. Then this kind of curvy part of the ilium is called the iliac fossa. That, you know, and that's a word we've been running into a little bit whenever there's a kind of a ditchy part along the bone. Now, this is another ditchy part, but it doesn't get the same name. Here, along the posterior portion of the ilium, this gets called the gluteal surface. So the gluteal surface of the ilium. All right. Then we take a look at some pubis things. You know, this pelvis isn't a great example, but there is a little pubic tubercle, and so there that is, you know, probably, you know, if you had to name that, now that you know a bit of anatomy, you might call that a pubic tubercle, you know, a little bump along a bone. All right. There's also the pubic symphysis, and that's in reference to this joining. Now, really, also the ischium is coming up here as well, but they call it the pubic symphysis, and it's a fibrous joint. And then I'll go, the next thing I'll talk about is this hole that's between the pubis and the ischium. And this is called the obturator foramen. The obturator nerve goes through there. Maybe that's not a surprise. Then, you know, this is an ilium structure, but I'll talk about it now. This is where you see the sacrum. So here's the good old sacrum, and it joins with the ilium. We talked about that when I showed you the sacrum. Now, this is called the sacroiliac joint. You can see it here, too. I also hear it being called the iliosacral joint. So, yeah. But we'll go sacroiliac joint. Now, this structure is really at the spot where all 3 of those bones join together. And it's obviously a very rounded socket, and you can imagine the head of the femur goes in here. This is the acetabulum. Some people call it the acetabulum, whatever floats your boat. I call it the acetabulum. Then we've got this kind of curvy area that's along in this lower portion of the ilium, and this is called the greater sciatic notch. And we've run into a few notches. This notch is associated with a nerve, the sciatic nerve, kind of swinging and exiting out the pelvis in that area. Then taking a look at some ischium structures. There's the ischial spine there. There it is on the other side. And then this really large, thick inferior portion of the ischium. That's the ischial tuberosity. Okay. All right, so now we're going to go over some of the functions of these features of bones that I've told you about. You know, what do these landmarks do? And so I think I'll start with the ilium. That was the bone that we started out with. And I'll start here on this side of the ilium where we have this really big and obvious crest, and also the gluteal surface. And not surprisingly, the gluteus muscles originate here. We have 3 different gluteus muscles, and the maximus is the one that originates here along the crest, and it kind of originates as this kind of big, wide origin area. It's an impressive and largest muscle of our body. Not the longest, but it is the widest. And then the gluteus medius originates along here, and the gluteus minimus originates down here. So it kind of makes sense for this to be called the gluteal surface, and there's all of the gluteal muscles are originating there. And you know, this really unusual shape, well, I shouldn't say, just this very distinctive shape of the human pelvis. The gluteus maximus was very important for humans to be upright, be bipedal. For instance, we'll be looking at the gluteus maximus and medius on the cat, but they won't be very large or impressive. The gluteus maximus is not large on a cat. But if, you know, I happen to have a femur here. It's not the right size, but so we have that gluteal tuberosity here and the gluteal surface, and so you have this muscle that expands along here, and what it helps to do is to make sure that we're able to have our pelvis be pulled upright over the leg, so that it's, you know, otherwise we'd have this tendency to kind of flop over like this. And so having this really large muscle to be able to kind of pull up like this in this upright position, this is kind of the position that it would be for a cat. Maybe a chimpanzee would be a better comparison, but I guess the best would be the ancestor to humans. But we have the very large gluteus maximus muscle that kind of is able to help pull this, and was important for being upright bipedal. So it ends up being an impressive and wide muscle in humans, and very distinctive of humans compared to other mammals. The ischial tuberosity is a really also impressive and obvious part of the pelvis. It's kind of called the sit bones. It is kind of what you sit on when you sit. Maybe you're sitting right now. Maybe you can feel your own ischial tuberosity if no one's watching. Then we're going to be learning all of the muscles that are a part of the hamstrings, and they all have origins here, or at least part of an origin here. So muscles that we'll be learning, like bicep femoris, semimembranosus, semitendinosus, they have their origins here. So that's kind of neat. And well, the pubic symphysis is interesting in that it can soften at childbirth. This fibrous joint that's in there, there's a muscle, I should say a hormone called relaxin, and it does function to help relax at this joint, but not just only at this joint, but it does help in childbirth. We will be, like I said, comparing female and male pelvises. There is a difference in the pelvises. The acetabulum distance ends up being different in females and males, you know, what the distance is between there. There's something called the pelvic inlet, which is this, compared to the pelvic outlet, which is kind of encompassed here. And that you can compare for males and females. It's influenced by how do the ischial tuberosities and ischial spines, how do they angle? What's the angle of the sacrum? And those are some differences, along with this acetabulum difference. There's the pubic arch. That's another thing that you can take a look at to compare males and females. And then I'll be talking about some of the consequences of this. What about these anatomical changes in the pelvis for females to make it easier for childbirth? What does that mean for locomotion? It is a bit of a compromise to be able to modify this pelvis to make it better for childbirth. What are the consequences of that? I mean, why don't males just have that shape too? They don't. So for females, the modification towards an easier childbirth, there's other modifications, giving birth to infants that are fairly earlier on in development compared to other mammals, a bit more altricial. Let's see, what other kinds of functional, oh, well, you know, the sacroiliac joint, that, again, thinking about some of the modifications of the pelvis to make it better for upright bipedalism. If you think for humans, we're a bit different in that all this weight is coming from straight above, whereas in quadrupedal organisms, they have some of their weight coming down their hind legs, and then some of their weight going down their forelegs. And so the weight is distributed kind of like a bridge with these two big posts, whereas we are all just on these two posts and everything's coming down. And the transfer of weight of all of that needs to go to these, well, I'm calling them hind limbs, but you can just think of them as legs, you know, for humans. One of the modifications was to be able to get the sacroiliac joint to be as close to the acetabulum. And that is an overall change to the human pelvis. If you compare it to a cat pelvis or any other kind of mammal pelvis, I think another good comparison is comparing maybe a chimpanzee to something like Australopithecus afarensis, one of our ancestors, one of the first upright bipedal organisms, and also without the compromise for childbirth. They aren't giving birth to little babies with big heads. Well, they didn't, but they were around 3.5 million years ago. So it's interesting to take a look at some of these comparisons in the pelvis, and those are some of the main functional aspects that I wanted to talk about.